The path of the growth warrior is all about the internal spiritual quest that being an entrepreneur puts us on.
We're back for another episode of the CEO series on the B2B Growth Show. I'm your host, John Belizaire, editor of the CEO Playbook, an online publication full of stories from real CEOs and practical sage advice for founders and CEOs of high-growth companies. Today, we'll be talking about mastering yourself, being a growth warrior. Throughout this series, we discuss how the role of the CEO is not a destination, but it's a journey, and that journey can be a solitary one. But an unknown secret is that much of the journey is really about your growth, personally and professionally. It's about learning how you deal with stress tests, crises. You're constantly at war with yourself, mastering that growth one day at a time. For this episode, I'm joined by a close friend and special guest, Phelon. She has been through the CEO journey several times and often says to be a CEO and an entrepreneur, you have to be a growth warrior, fighting for your own professional and personal growth. After spending more than a decade as a Silicon Valley entrepreneur and raising millions for companies in the technology and SaaS industries, Promise founded Growth Warrior Capital to work with underdog entrepreneurs to gain funding, transform markets, and create profitable opportunities while providing the resources and tools for them to accelerate their businesses. Prior to the Growth Warrior, Promise held positions as CEO of Tap Influence, CRO of Jazz HR, and founder and CEO of Upmo and the Phelon Group. Promise has spoken previously at large-scale events including South by Southwest, Inbound, SaaStr, and she's a regular contributor to Forbes and Fortune. This episode is more of a fireside chat where we discuss her new book, The Way of the Growth Warrior, 7 Non-Negotiable Skills to Scale Your Business in Uncertain Times. We talk about serial entrepreneurship, what it means to be an underdog, how to be a growth warrior. We talk about how to lead during a crisis, and we use her own experiences to tell the story. And we talk about one thing that we're both passionate about, and that's anti-fragility. This is also the first in a series of episodes you'll hear that were recorded during the coronavirus pandemic. Believe it or not, I recorded this episode in New York City, the epicenter of the pandemic, in a makeshift recording studio in my coat closet. Okay, let's get into it. Promise, welcome to the show.
Thank you, John. This is exciting. Thanks for having me today.
So we're both talking to each other, I imagine, sequestered in our homes, shelter in place. Well, you're in California, so you're by law, you should be sheltered in place. New York, which is the epicenter of the coronavirus. If you're listening to this, when this was recorded, the world is fighting a very unique war, a pandemic, and we're all trying to make heads and tails of it. So it's great to have you with us. Promise, I'd like to chat with you about, what CEOs are dealing with at this time, your background, and a host of other topics. So I think this is going to be fun. And we've known each other for a long time, so I'm sure we're going to have a great time doing this. But for our listeners, it'd be great if you could just tell us a bit about yourself, your story. Everyone says they're serial entrepreneurs, but it'd be helpful to just hear from you what that means from your perspective and what that's been like. So how did you get here? What's your story?
Wow, how did I get here? I could tell that story chronologically, which is, of course, extremely boring. I guess I'll talk about it in terms of, kind of three major themes, career themes. Like you, I became an entrepreneur very, very young. And so I got a lot of experience, building my first company in college, selling it, going to grad school at a really young age. And so the kind of consistent theme at the earlier part of my career.
What was the company, by the way? I'm always intrigued by people's first company.
Well, the first one wasn't sexy. So the first company
I'll share mine too.
I want to hear yours. I mean,
Okay.
I had triple majored in college, and my mother got lupus when I was in college and couldn't afford to pay for college anymore. And so I started house sitting and I dog ran, John. I ran a dog running service. That was the survival. And then I realized it's just basically not scalable. And I started a company that was a communications firm that wrote content for physicians and did marketing. And then we actually built an automation tool that would build press releases based on data and stuff from the internet. And I sold that to my largest customer like the last year that I was in college. And that funded me actually going to grad school. But I'm really eager to hear, what was your first
Wow.
first
Good for
company?
you. you're saying those are boring. Those were cool. My very first entrepreneurial experience was actually in high school. I
Okay.
always used that as sort of like my first entrepreneurship experience. And my high school was one of the few high schools in the New York City public school system that had a computing program.
Interesting.
And they had these old mainframe systems and terminals. So these microcomputers on the desk, and there's a little mainframe computer in the room. And you would, type your program and it would get printed on these, mini printers in the mainframe room. And when the class was over, you would have to store your program on a large floppy disk. And and they gave you one for free. And when it filled up, you had to sort of fend for yourself to figure out where to get it. And because they didn't have a great supply chain. And so I started thinking, like, where do they get these things? And maybe I can help solve that problem, because I looked around and I didn't see, a lot of my classmates from Brooklyn sourcing floppy disks. And so I found this distributor that sold them. And it just so happened that they sold all different versions of them and different sizes. And I convinced my brother to go in with me on buying it. And,
Wow.
my background, I'm Haitian American, and there's this concept of this savings account, kind of microfinance. People, all contribute to what's called a susu.
Mm-hmm.
And, everybody gives $30 or $100 every week or whatever. And then there's a list, and it starts from the top of the list and it goes down. So each week, one person gets it. So it's like a way to save. So we entered into one of those. I think we'd save like $500 or something like that. And then I bought a pack of these things. I think it's probably like 300 or something in there. And then I started selling them. I think the first disc was like $2, and I started selling them for like $5 or something like that. Because I actually bought, I was like, well, why are we paying $5? First of all, do you have any other place to get them? And no. And number two, I actually found a distributor that made different colors. So it was red, yellow, green, blue, so you can get like your favorite color. That was my first business.
You've always been a marketer. I love it. Right, getting back to the pricing and packaging. Well, and it's funny because if I think about, so I wrote this book because at this stage in my life, in my early 40s, I got to this point where I was like, someone asks you to tell your story, and your story is evolving, but you also want to kind of put a stake in the ground and say, where have I been? How did I get here? And I've been, as an African American woman in tech in Silicon Valley, you look back at your successes, selling my company in college, going to grad school, getting a mentor, Barbara Britton, which got me connected into Silicon Valley, being part of BEA's run up, starting a couple companies, having some be very successful, one not, and then going into a stream of like venture-backed turnarounds in C-level positions where you're raising money. You realize that you're not actually stopping you do a great job of kind of pausing and asking yourself, how did I get here? But, in riding the way of the growth warrior, that was a way for me to look at it. And if I look at it in retrospect, I think there are three things. I got really lucky in relationship. Met you, Barbara Britton, Ivan Kuhn, Bill Campbell, had all these relationships where people were not only mentors, but they were like, hey, I'm going to give you a chance you actually don't deserve right now. Because, I can see myself in your future. So that's number one. Number two is, I think Serial used to be, I've done a lot of things, I have a lot of experience, but I actually think that serial entrepreneur is someone who is a growth-minded person looking for that next opportunity for growth, right? It's a proclamation. It's not regression. It's not looking back and saying, oh, these are the serial things I've done. I've done these things in series. It's saying, you're going to always expect to see me doing something that is pushing my limits. So that's the second. And the third is I feel that I finally have accepted and understand my superpower, which is something that you have to give up the desire and the idea of who you thought you were going to be, like this picture you had of yourself. And where I am now and how I've gotten here is actually just said, okay, I have superpowers that exist in a certain area or areas, and they're highly nuanced. And so I'm going to find ways in which I can use, expose, and leverage those for the benefit of myself and others. And so in terms of how I got here, I've done a lot of what you've done. You've been massively successful. I get to watch you from the sidelines and cheer. But it's all about relationships. It's a proclamation for growth. And third, it's accepting that there are areas in which I would love to be phenomenal and be self-expressed, but there are areas in which I am, and I feel great about those things. Does that make sense?
It does, very much so. I mean, to be so grounded and have a clear understanding of where you've come from, your experience, and what you're good at is part of the journey. Many people are hoping to get to that point at some point. They're just sort of, taking it day by day right now. So it's very exciting. Actually, I've read the book.
You've read the book.
So I'm
Read the
not going to
first
spoil
version.
it too much here, but I recommend everyone read it. Great story. So I have a question I've been asking everyone on the show. Your first time as a CEO, like what you would call your proper like CEO. Every CEO sort of perceives that first time differently, and when they would say the first time really was. But when you were CEO for the first time, what would you say that was like? What was that like?
Yeah. So the first time was after I met you at BEA. And I went on to start a services company, which became a tech-enabled services company. And I realized I can remember the day. I want to say, it must have been '03. And, I started this company in a downturn, kind of similar to what we're experiencing right now. And I remember someone coming to me and saying, hey, I want to just talk to you. And I was running a company, maybe there were like 10 or so people. And this person said to me, hey, I wanted you to know that, I'm going through this adoption process. And I just appreciate that, you gave me that merit bump because it's going to help me and my partner create the family of our dreams. And I remember just being like, I was in my 20s and I was like, I did that? Okay. And then you realize as a CEO that you are paying mortgages that are not your own. You're helping families form. Like people are relying on you. And it creates this, for me, this euphoria of like, I can manifest. But I think it also created a lot of like, oh shit, like I better have my act together. Like, people are really counting on me. And
I had a
similar situation. Go ahead, share.
No, I had a similar experience once as a CEO where it was a big all hands meeting, and I come into the room and folks started arriving before we had the big meeting, and I come out of my office and everyone's in the office. We had a pretty distributed team. Once a year, we'd bring everybody in, and everyone was in the room and in the office. I'm like, wow, it's hustling, bustling, and I'm like, holy smokes, we have a lot of people in this company, And then I thought, holy shit, we have a lot of people.
I did this.
Yeah, it's like, So I can relate to that feeling. Sorry to interrupt you. Please.
No,
please
but
continue.
it's exciting because like you get to live in that distortion field and see something that no one else saw before, and now you've created it, and it's exciting and frightening that first time. Yeah, I would just say that the first experience of that was when someone kind of was helping me see the impact of my vision in their lives, not like a customer or a client, but like a real person who's going to adopt a child. And it was beautiful. And I think about that a lot. I think it's also very humbling because it means that the frailties that you bring into being a human, you actually have to work on those because people need consistency. Does that make, and
totally
actually
makes sense. Yeah.
The first chapter of the book, as I was organizing this book, and we can talk about how I put it together, but the first chapter is about managing and mastering yourself. That being the number one skill of being a great entrepreneur, because right now people are out there and they're like, this customer paid late. It's easy to get emotional and to react and to be in that place where you feel helpless or you feel anger. And you, as a human, it's easy to react. But as an entrepreneur who's a CEO who's leading, you kind of got to think about the lesson. Like, okay, if I do this, what are the repercussions, short, medium, and long term, not only for me, but for everyone around me?
That's right. Yeah. And I agree that as CEO, you quickly realize that everyone is looking to you. And to your earlier point, you really got to have yourself together because they will continue to look to you. You are the example that they're looking to. to figure out how they should be feeling, how they should be reacting to just about everything that's going on in the business. Let's talk about learnings. What were some of your learnings, perhaps from that first time, that stay with you today? Just give us one or two, perhaps, that like, oh man, from that first experience, I learned something that I'll never forget.
Well, okay, so I'll answer that, but can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
I mean, you've recently become a father, 2 babies, which is beautiful.
Thank you.
Has that changed how you think about leadership? And has it, I mean, I don't know if you reflect on that in terms of how you show up at work, but has it affected you? How has it affected you?
Well, it's definitely grounded me more. I feel like as a CEO, prior to having children, I was sort of willing to, fly to the moon to solve any situation. And I have learned to balance that sort of, limitless energy with my personal life. And the other thing that fatherhood has taught me is how similar forming, building, and developing a company is to raising a child. To some extent, companies are sort of like living and breathing things. They start out very young, they're very fragile. They still have to learn a lot of things. It's your job to teach them those things. And, as they become, more mature and self-sufficient, your job is really to teach them a set of principles that they can take with them for a long time. And I really believe companies are very similar to that. Culture is one of the tools you use to accomplish what I've just described. But it has changed my perspective on what a company is. It's not just a bunch of people taking on a salary. It's almost like a child that you're raising.
It's interesting. I was at a business conference, I don't know, a few months ago, and Tony Robbins, who is a dope businessman, and I've learned a lot from him. But he talks about that. He talks about the maturation of a company follows the maturation of a human. And that when you go from being an infant, right, to being an adolescent and to teenager and to young adult and to mature, and that you're positively trying to get out of the mature state where the company becomes about maintenance and stability and move it back into those earlier stages in a controlled way, right? Because a teenager can move quickly and be agile, whereas you don't want to go back into adolescence because there's a lot of fragility and dependency.
Well, we'll talk about it in a moment, but the truth is that companies, they do regress, just like children regress. They do regress over time as the businesses you're in, the markets you're in, the challenges you confront. And that regression is the time that, you dig in, right? And to sort of, help it get to the next level. I don't have teenagers yet, but as I understand it, that's the next major regression challenge that I'll have to deal with. Anyway, luckily I'm not there yet.
Not yet. You'll be ready though. You'll be ready.
Yeah.
Yes. I mean, I think, so today, I sold my last company in middle of 2018. It was turnaround, venture backed. We sold it with public company. And I probably spent 6 months, and I talked to you during that 6 months going, what the heck? Like, what am I going to do? And it's the best of times because you're like, I get to plan my day today while I'm in it. I get to wake up and say what I'm going to do. But it's also, I think, a time where you kind of go, okay, how do I continue to evolve? And so one of the things that I did, and I think about, especially now as we're in all this chaos, is I kind of got out of myself and I said, okay, if I focus on me, there's going to be suffering. And like, oh, I don't have this, and why am I not running another company again? And I started to focus more on mentoring others. And out of that, this whole concept of anti-fragility, I read Nassim Taleb's book again after I sold my company. And it opened up like a whole concept that I'm actually helping. So I bought a few companies. I started a few companies, and I'm on a bunch of boards now. And you asked me earlier what advice I'm giving my companies. So this may sound extreme, so forgive me. So one is kind of being in the right emotional state right now, which means meditating, spending as much time as possible with people who you love and who love you. So let's put that as a first anchor. But afterwards, if you're running an existing company that's got employees and investors and customers and cash, I think the most important thing now is to make the hardest decision that you possibly can as soon as possible. When I started the Phelon Group back in 2002, we thought the economy had recovered, then realized in early '03 it hadn't. And so the expansion plans that we had made were all premature. And we had one big customer kind of bolt for economic reasons. And rather than taking the cuts at once, we took them in small pieces, right?
Right.
And that is incredibly hard for a business. It's hard for the emotions and the personality and the culture, but it's very hard for the individuals, the leaders, to constantly be thinking, should I do it? Should I not do it? How should I do it? And so my advice that I'm telling my companies now is plan for this lasting for a long time and make the hardest decisions you have to make now, and do them in a way that just focuses on how much cash can we preserve for as long as possible.
Right.
And then the
Right.
second thing, I think, is come out of it sooner. So while everyone else is trying to recover, when you see those signals that it's coming out, recover before other people do. And that's when you do acquisitions. That's when you do expansion. You sort of get ahead of that curve. But the last thing is love on your customers and your people in a way that you have not before. And it doesn't mean like sending out emails about, hand washing. Like Brene Brown says, trust is the accumulated stacking of vulnerabilities. Like me being vulnerable, then you, then me, then you, then me, then you, me, you. And in a crisis, people let down a lot of ego. And I would say this is the best time to talk about employee aspirations, to spend that extra 20 minutes to have a discussion with your customer and say, like, how's your family? Like, what's going on? How are you feeling? Because this is the time when you will build relationships that really will last. And I feel that we get so much into what's happening that we're not externally reaching out, connecting, mentoring, building bridges, and being as vulnerable as possible with people who will treat us very differently on the other side of this. I mean, I hope those were concepts that hung together, but I just feel like right now, this is a massive opportunity for all of us to grow deeply trusting relationships with customers, partners, investors, board members, teams that we just haven't had the opportunity to do in the past.
No, you're so right. A company is more than a list of contracts in a database, right? It's an ecosystem, a community of people. I tried to burn that into people's minds all the time that, when there'd be like these challenging emails, I'd say, pick up the phone, There's a person behind that email. Why don't you just ask them what they're trying to say, And
Not interpret.
yeah, rather than interpret. And so in times like this, people want to communicate more and talk more and work through their issues. And this is the time, as you said, for the CEO to first of all work through their own personal issues, get their head right, and then be available for their employees, their customers. There are going to be some hard conversations to be had with each individual in the company and the sponsors of the product at these companies, right? And that's when you can come up with the collaborative solutions to what both sides are challenged with, right? Everybody's going to be on lockdown when it comes to liquidity and spending. Maybe you just give them the product for free and say, pay me when you can, It may be hard for you to do that because you might die as a company, but you might actually not die because everyone will see that you had pretty significant customer growth, and at some point people will be able to pay and it could turn the entire company around. I agree with you 100% that making those tough decisions faster, the longer you wait, the worse it gets. And by the way, those decisions include and are not limited to asking some of your longtime friends and relationships that you've developed at these companies to leave the company. And those can be the most challenging for a CEO and probably the most gut-wrenching and emotional, but they're so important to the survival of the long-term vision of the company and ultimate transformation of the company beyond what's happening now.
Right. And I totally feel that. And what's funny about all of this is that stress is good for our system. Right.
Yeah,
Like
it is, yeah.
ultimately, these stressful times, if we do the right thing, will deepen and nurture and strengthen these. Like, I feel like the stresses in relationships. Someone said, when you're thinking about building a relationship, you think about all these incredible moments of like, oh, the honeymoon, or that time we went to Disney World, when in reality, it's these moments that you really cherish, right? It's coming through it together. And maybe you have, but I'll speak for myself. I've had to let a lot of people go in my career, either, corporate restructuring, or we sold the company, or we bought something, or, it just, corporations are organic. And what I try to remember is, I have faith in this person. I have faith that they understand that this is a business decision. And I have faith in our relationship that it will get better. I have faith. And what I layer on is what can I do? How can I be in service? Because if you have to let an employee go, and you say, look, here are the papers, sign, versus this hurts me. How can I be in service of what is important to you, because I've asked you the right questions and I understand? So I feel that this is a time where that employee will come back and work for you in the future, because we don't remember the honeymoon. We remember the divorce. And so if we can
that's right.
have faith and trust that this is actually a relationship that doesn't live or die by the payroll, I mean, you have a whole crew of people that you've worked with multiple times. I mean, your Theory Center guys, you guys are all still together, if I remember correctly.
We're very close friends. They're probably the closest friends. These are my original co-founders. I talk a lot about them in the articles I write on our website. I can resonate very much so with what you're talking about. And as I said earlier, companies are made of people, and people are independent of those companies. Your relationship with those people can be lifelong relationships if you choose them to be so. CEOs are people, and not just a title. And
CEO are people too.
Yeah, they're people too. They're not just sort of like this, title on high. So, and they have feelings and emotions, and they want to have relationships. And so I've focused a lot on that. To your point about sort of, self-management and self-mastery, it's really sort of keeping that notion clear in my mind that at the end of the day, I'm building a company, but I'm also building a network and a set of relationships with people that I will have for a very long time. I still engage with former employees of mine who I asked to leave the companies that I've run, and we're still very closely together. And these people have gone on to do very well for themselves. And I still keep in touch with folks who are still at the company and part of whatever other firm that acquired the business, et cetera. And I talk to them not as their CEO. I just talk to them as John, their friend. In fact, sometimes even when I was in the seat, one of the things I'd like to do, I would do very often, is I would say, hey, I'm going to tell you something here, but this is not John, your CEO, speaking. It's John, your friend.
Totally.
And they were surprised that I would say that. And they'll say, yeah, at the end of the day, we're just all friends here. But yes, we have like professional roles that we're taking, right? Like that we're playing in the company. But at the end of the day, we're people, and that's what will help save the company.
Are you currently making the transition from founder to CEO? Are you a first-time CEO in the middle of a huge challenge? Or are you just curious about what it takes? Then you need to read CEO Playbook. It's an online publication full of stories from real CEOs and practical sage advice for leaders of high-growth companies. Go to ceoplaybook.co to start reading some amazing content for free. You'll find out why over 400 CEOs go here to learn what it's really like being CEO.
Tell me a bit more. I mean, I really enjoyed the book. There are a number of skills that I think would be very, very helpful given where we are. And I want to sort of talk about some of those. Let's start with crafting the story. That's skill 2, I believe, from your book, right? Crafting your story.
Wow, good memory.
So, you talk a lot about sort of, crafting the warrior story. Who are you? Who are you as a person? Who your company is, and how do you shape that? How would you see that changing now in sort of this crisis time? Do you sort of maintain the story, or find opportunities to recraft the story to reposition the company as the world requires?
Great question. Yeah, and it's interesting. That's the second skill, and the reason why I feel we all need a warrior story, which is, it's a way to tell your story in a way that is memorable, compelling, passionate, but also connective. Because in these times, we're all, cocooning. We're all sort of having our own, kind of concern about our finances. Like, everyone is having the same experience. And so rather than telling a resume story or a bulleted kind of list of what you've done and where you've worked, which isn't memorable and which creates separation, right? Because then I go, well, I didn't get a job at Google. You did. You went to Harvard. You went to Cornell. What more? And so a warrior story is looking for connection. It is saying, wow, we're going through some challenging times. Here's what I'm living right now. I feel very solid financially, personally, but I'm also mentoring a lot of early stage companies who are very concerned about their funding situation. I've got companies going through turnarounds. And so a warrior story is a way to tell your story that builds connection. And the best times are when you're at war. And right now, we're at war with ourselves, right? Managing the fact that, I've been in these walls in this house for 2.5, 3 weeks, right?
Yeah.
Everything's blowing up. So I can connect. Right. So if the warrior story is telling your story in a way that connects people and allows them to see themselves in you. And I would absolutely say that it's evolving right now. And I think it's important that story evolves. One of the companies that I mentor is in a really kind of interesting industry. It's in the network marketing space. And so they've built a really cool technology. And that space is booming right now because it focuses on at-home professionals. And
interesting. When
that CEO goes and talks to investors about it, I mean, I had them change their whole pitch. It's about the fact that 100% of people are going to have side hustles. And everyone's going to be, and so the story is no longer about the technology or the market. It's about that one person who doesn't have $600 for an emergency, which is most of our economy, most of the people out there, which is why that, package was so big. But now that CEO can tell a story that we can all relate to. Oh, I know someone who's like that. Oh, I know some, and so that connection now is an emotional one, which is the only kind of connection that's memorable. And so the warrior story is just doing that in a way that is intentional.
Which reminds me, Promise, you liken entrepreneurship to being a warrior. In fact, you've titled the book The Way of the Warrior. Explain why. Where does that come from? You like a Bruce Lee fan or something like that? Or I mean, I used to watch a lot of those movies, but
I did watch. You'll have to share my movie watching list since we've been in at home. It will surprise you.
Yeah, I would like to get that. Yeah,
but it's a growth warrior, and the reason why it's not about being a warrior, it's a growth warrior, which is I'm out there in battle, but my focus is on my own growth. I had running my last company. It was a turnaround. I told you about it. It was a challenging experience, and I go into detail in the book about it.
It's in the book, yeah.
It's in the book, and so I go into detail about walking into a company that was distressed, leading a turnaround, managing culture in the way that I thought was best versus what was actually best for the company, driving a lot of growth, being massively successful in that company, selling it, which was the goal from the beginning, and feeling in the end that it did not fill me up. It was not spiritually fulfilling. And there was a lot of suffering around it because, it was hard. I moved, I got divorced in the process. So there was a lot of emotion around that experience. But upon reflection, that's all this, like, we came here to have all these experiences for the purposes of growth. And so it became less about anything external, and the path of the growth warrior is all about the internal spiritual quest that being an entrepreneur puts us on. We have chosen the most unsafe route to nirvana of any professional. If you go work in a big company, you get a paycheck, you get healthcare, right? Like,
right.
We have to create that.
Although these days that's not necessarily, bulletproof.
It's evolving. It's evolving.
Yeah.
But you're a growth warrior. You go through every experience. And what I love about you is, like, you'll pause and say, what did I learn? What was my takeaway? Who am I now? And so that's what the whole process about is, like, living for the growth and not for any external validation, money. Like, it isn't about that. It's about the spiritual growth that comes from this.
Mm. Your comment about pausing and reflecting, I thought you have a great system for doing that. Sometimes wanting to do it and knowing how to do it are two different things. And you talk a lot about how you've made almost a ritual out of it, right? Where you spend a certain amount of time, I believe, at the end of the day or in the morning, where you're talking to yourself and recording yourself. Is that right?
Yeah. So 3 things. I do morning pages. And I just, gratitude, what happened yesterday, what is my intention for this day? And it's just a couple minutes. You just get it out. So you're able to go back, and I have stacks. Dude, I have morning pages from when I was 16. It is absolutely
Really?
insanity.
So you've been doing it since then. Wow.
Oh, yeah. I mean, just capturing it, right? And the second is, especially in these trying times, like when I was going through turnarounds, I would just sit in the car because I wanted to exit the emotion of the day or what I learned and just, like, get my voice note and just record. And then on the weekend, if I were hiking or working out, I would just replay all those days. And that's actually what freed me and what helped write the book, is because I could go back and go, oh man, I remember that day fundraising, or I remember that board meeting. And it wasn't, because memory isn't real.
You were going through those notes. That's great.
I was going through those notes.
Fantastic.
Memory's not real. Like, memory, what we actually remember is getting revised every time we think about it. We go into a file. I mean, you're a tech guy. You're a technical CEO. You go into a file and you pull it out. You're actually changing that memory every single time neurologically. So it's actually not true. And so to go back and actually hear what I said on January 13th of 2016, I go back to the closest record to the truth.
Right.
And so I do that on a regular basis. And it's a beautiful habit, but it also just keeps you honest with yourself.
Yeah. Do you find that it's helpful also to, and it's kind of tantamount to something I talk a bit about, which is finding time for solitude, just giving yourself the gift of being by yourself to just think, talk, process, learning, write down, and then have it recorded for you down the road. And as a result, you sort of come out refreshed and having lots of insight. Do you also find it helpful to reducing your anxiety because, your stuff is not sort of bouncing around in your head. It's now on a page and you can see it clearly and process it.
So yes to all of that. I love I take 6 hours a month and I go away by myself and I go to a coffee shop and I ask myself 3 questions and they change. And this is why I can't wait until you write your book, because I'm gonna be all over you. Okay. But
yes,
it's the book writing process. It's for you. It's not, it's for you. It's a forcing function. And I love that you write your newsletter now, because you're doing that. You're basically codifying all the things that you learned. And stuff comes up.
Interesting.
Stuff comes up. Like I write my 6 Bullet Sunday, and you write your CEO playbook, which I take credit for because I think we started around the same time.
Yes, you are my inspiration.
I've worked to be that. But I think the book, Seth Godin is a friend of mine. And I called him and I said, hey, I'm writing this book. And he says, write it literally as if you don't care who's going to read
whether
it.
anyone reads it.
Yeah. It's
That's
yours. It's yours. And so I took that approach. It's a process of actually going inward and saying, let me be honest here. So it's not a memoir. I thought about, I'm like, I'm not that interesting. Like if I were, if I were like Obama or like Jay-Z or Chameleonaire, it would be interesting.
Right. Yeah.
So it's more lessons and prescription and direction. And I go into like how to size a market. You know what I mean? Like it's not a memoir, but it comes from that place.
Right. Well, I think we would be remiss. Thanks for sharing that, by the way.
Yeah.
And yes, when I finally decide to write my book, you will be the first person I call. So we would be remiss, I think, that you and I, if we didn't talk about what it's like being a CEO that looks like we do, right?
Ooh.
Women, African American, immigrants, etc. What's your perspective on that? So, listeners who are out there who are, looking to get into the game of being CEO and are unsure about it or want to understand what it's like, what are some of the challenges? What would you say to them?
So I'm an
Yeah.
African American woman, and
Mm-hmm.
I didn't go to Stanford or Harvard. I went
Mm-hmm.
to Southern Methodist University. And, for undergrad, Brad Smith, the former CEO of Intuit, said if you have to have a longitudinal description of your university, it's probably an underdog school. Southern Methodist University, right?
You have to,
You have to say
give a GPS location, then,
GPS
Yeah,
coordinate
exactly.
associated. It's
Right,
probably
right,
underdog university.
right. Just,
So
yeah.
it's a Harvard of Dallas is what we like to say.
Yeah.
You know what? Bill Campbell told me something, and I remember it. He said, it's going to be really hard for you. It's going to take you
Yeah.
longer. It's going to be
Mhm.
different. And so I have two perspectives. One is if your desire for whatever it is supersedes your fear of the rejection and the repetition and all the things that come with like being in the game and not looking like, looking like a
Mhm.
typical or traditional CEO. If your desire isn't greater than that fear, then don't do
Mhm.
it.
Mm.
But if your desire is,
That's- I like that.
lean in and crush it. Like lean in. There are some people have written me checks. I've grown. I've gotten technical. I've sat with engineers. I've been part of release. Like I've done it all because my desire was greater than my fear. And so if your desire is greater than your fear, go for it. Someone's going to believe in you and see themselves in you, and you'll get where you want to go. I think the other thing is I feel this thing is changing. John, the last lead
Mhm.
investor in my last company
Mhm.
who wrote the largest check was a 50-something white male from North Carolina.
Mhm.
And he today is he's my biggest champion. I talked to him yesterday. So
Wow.
I believe the game is changing because if the $100 billion that was invested in venture capital in 2018 and 2019 is more than that, but that went to mostly to people who look like you would expect, right?
Right.
So that means that all those ideas and all those concepts came with that logical train of my experience and who I am. So imagine that this world is big and complex and doesn't look like those people, right? That's the minority. Imagine if someone who has a unique perspective or a unique understanding of a market or a cohort or a customer comes in and cracks open an opportunity that no one else has thought of. Like, it is the time for the person who doesn't look like a surgeon to be hired as one. You know what I'm saying? Like, it couldn't
That's right.
be better because we've been exploiting opportunities that are so narrow. If I see one more pitch for a scooter company or,
Well, you do have the herd mentality that happens in VC. That's sort of part of that game, right? But
VCs
you're
win
right.
big when they bet against that.
That's right. Yeah,
So
exactly right.
go for it is what I tell it. It may take you longer. It may hurt a
Mhm.
little bit, but
Mhm.
get in it for the growth. Don't get in it for any other reason. Get in it for the growth.
Yeah,
How
that's
do you
awesome.
feel about it? I mean, you've been massively successful. I remember when you were like 18 and we bought your company for like $1 billion. You sound all spiritual now.
Thank you. I was 28, but yes, but
You looked 18.
but yes, yeah, I look 18. Yes, exactly. The growth has taught me a lot, because you're right. It has not been easy. My success has come with a lot of work and, challenges along the way, all of them just making me incredibly stronger. I used to look at what the prototypical CEO was meant to be. I was like, okay, no one would ever give us money because I don't look like that guy. And you're right. There's always one person, one firm that will give you a chance, and not every investor is for you. And
Amen.
once you get the right investor and you get the support of that investor, you can go infinitely, from that point to your goals and beyond. And you can keep doing it because each time you win, each time you lose, you're learning. And the more you leverage that learning and and understand how it's really playing a role to your growth, to your point, then, that's when you're going to get the growth. And that's when you're going to get the success happening. And that's when you're going to realize that you can do just about anything that anybody else can do. And I encourage lots of young new CEOs that I meet now who look like I looked when you first met me. And I say, hey, like Bill Campbell said, it's going to be hard. It's not easy, but it's that toughness, that hard road, if you will, is the thing that will make you one of the best. And I encourage them to take on that challenge.
I wonder, sorry, I was just going to add it. The Bill Campbell quote is something I think about him all the time. And I think about him all the time. But the thing that I got from him, and I get also from Brad Smith, and I admire him so much as a leader and as a human, is I guess the third thing I would say, and maybe you see this as well, is we can't write off the guy who we think is this Harvard-educated venture investor or someone who holds the purse strings. We can't assume that they don't understand our story, right? And that they're not also an underdog. Because I would venture that, first of all, every CEO that you're going to find who's been successful as you've been successful, John, is going to say it wasn't easy. They may have a different version of difficult than you did, but they're working.
Absolutely.
And they have challenges. And
it's a tough role.
When you walk into a room where you're asking for money or you're asking for resources or whatever, I wouldn't assume that person who doesn't look like you might not have the same shared experience, because they often do have the same shared experience. And if you don't give them the chance to prove to you that they do, then it just never happens. So I wouldn't assume that everyone else is looking at you as a stranger. I would assume that there are brethren and there's fellowship out there.
No, you're absolutely right. I mean, I've been reading some of the memoirs or biographies of some of these big hedge fund guys, and like the Ray Dalio book, you'll see that. I mean, he had a hard time. His road wasn't easy. It's easy to say that it was easy for him, but at some point he lost everything and had to borrow money from his father to take a flight to a consulting gig that he really needed to pay his bills. Pretty crazy. Everyone goes through challenges in their life, no matter what their background is. And so you shouldn't make any assumptions. I would agree with that.
Amen.
Promise, this has been great. Let me ask you just one last thing about the book, and which one of the skills that we didn't cover that you think would resonate with our listeners?
So we decided to accelerate the digital launch, just in spite of what's happening right now. But I would say the skill that people ask me a lot about, the two are, not surprisingly, how to raise money and how to capitalize what they do, especially in uncertain times. And the other that I've gone deep on is basically built to exit, which is the idea that as you are building your company, you're not building it to sell it, but you're building it with the idea that at some point you want to understand your market, your players, your competitors, your partners in a way that people know that your company is a valued asset. And so you manage it for an exit, and you think about that. So those are the ones that really I go into in the book. So how to capitalize, I go through all the stages and steps, but I also talk about some really cool stories about entrepreneurs who built to exit and actually decided not to exit. And so, I've sold companies, you have too, but there's definitely selling a company versus being so attractive in the market and so well known and regarded that people will approach you and know you when they're looking to expand through, kind of inorganic methods.
That's right. There's a difference between selling and being bought, being acquired, and structuring your company and understanding how to see the difference between the two and how you execute against it is very important. And I think you do a great job of that in the book. Well, this has been great. It's probably a good point to bring it to an end. And I want to say thank you so much for taking the time, and I'll see you soon.
Thank you, John. Cheers. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thanks for listening to this episode of CEO Series on B2B Growth. Again, I'm John Belizaire from the CEO Playbook. I hope you enjoyed this conversation as much as I did. Remember, entrepreneurship and being CEO can be a lifelong journey, one filled with many lessons. So take the time to grow from them. To learn more about Promise Phelon and her book, The Way of the Growth Warrior, visit thegrowthwarrior.com. That's thegrowthwarrior.com. Please connect with me on LinkedIn. I have a page, CEO Playbook, and Twitter @JBelazaireCEO. I'd love to hear from you. Send questions my way or recommendations. If you like this episode, please leave a review and share it with a friend. And if you have a question, join the discussion on Instagram. You'll find us at CEOPlaybook.co. Thank you for tuning in and subscribing to B2B Growth. Until next time, keep pushing and stay healthy out there.
I hate it when podcasts incessantly ask their listeners for reviews, but I get why they do it, because reviews are enormously helpful when you're trying to grow a podcast audience. So here's what we decided to do. If you leave a review for B2B Growth in Apple Podcasts and email me a screenshot of the review to james@sweetfishmedia.com, I'll send you a signed copy of my new book, Content-Based Networking, How to Instantly Connect with Anyone You Want to Know. We get a review, you get a free book. We both win.